I came home from the hospital in a wheelchair, still numb from the waist down in places, my spine held together with rods and screws that would take months to fully heal. I had spent 11 days in that hospital bed, unable to stand without 2 nurses supporting my weight, unable to do more than shift my legs a few inches, without pain shooting through my entire body. I thought the hardest part of this journey was already behind me. I was wrong. When my husband wheeled me through our own front door, I found suitcases stacked in my living room that did not belong to us, voices coming from rooms that should have been empty, and strangers who shared my husband's last name already unpacking their lives into what used to be my quiet, healing home. I remember sitting in that wheelchair in my own hallway, looking at my husband's face, waiting for an explanation that made any sense at all. He knelt beside me and said only that it was temporary, that his family needed help, that he would explain everything once I had rested. I did not have the strength that day to argue, to stand, or even to raise my voice above a whisper. That I simply sat there, surrounded by boxes and voices I did not recognize, in a house that no longer felt like mine, wondering what decision my husband had made while I was unconscious on an operating table, a decision that would take months to fully understand, and would nearly cost him everything he claimed to be protecting. This is the story of how 12 people moved into my home during the single most vulnerable month of my entire life, while I could barely lift myself out of bed, let alone defend the space I had spent 20 years building. It is the story of a husband's silence, a family's desperation, and a truth so carefully hidden that it took my own slow, painful recovery to finally bring it into the light. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand how I ended up recovering from spine surgery in a house full of strangers, you first need to understand the people at the center of this story. My name is Diane. My husband's name is Gerald. We had been married for 22 years, built a life together in the same modest house where I now sat, unable to walk, surrounded by relatives I barely knew, all of them suddenly living under our roof. For most of my marriage, I believed I understood Gerald completely, his quiet loyalty to his family, his occasional reluctance to discuss money, his habit of solving problems before I ever knew they existed. I did not yet understand how far that habit had gone, or how much it would eventually cost both of us. There are questions at the heart of this story that took me months of slow, painful recovery to fully answer. Why would Gerald choose the exact week of my surgery, the one moment I was completely unable to protect my own home, to move his entire extended family into our house without so much as a conversation beforehand? What was he protecting them from that felt urgent enough to risk our marriage over? And what had he been hiding from me for years, quietly, carefully, long before I ever went under anesthesia? By the end of this story, you will understand not just what happened inside my home during those difficult months, but how a husband's silence, however well-intentioned, can nearly destroy the very family he believes he is protecting. Gerald and I met in our late 20s, at a mutual friend's backyard cookout, back when neither of us had much money or many expectations beyond finding someone kind enough to build a steady life with. He was the kind of man who noticed when a chair needed fixing before anyone asked, who quietly paid for a neighbor's groceries when their card declined, who never made a show of his generosity but simply acted on it. I fell in love with that quality in him almost immediately. What I did not fully understand at the time was how deeply that same generosity was tangled up with his family, particularly his younger brother, Marcus, who had struggled financially for most of his adult life, while leaning on Gerald more heavily than I ever fully grasped. Gerald came from a large family, 6 siblings in total, raised by parents who had instilled in him from childhood that family always comes first, no matter the cost to yourself. I admired that value early in our marriage, even as I noticed small patterns that unsettled me over the years. Money would disappear from our joint savings account in amounts Gerald described only vaguely, as helping out or a temporary loan. Phone calls from Marcus would leave Gerald quiet and distracted for days afterward, though he rarely shared what troubled him. I asked questions occasionally, and Gerald always had an answer ready, calm and reasonable enough that I stopped pressing further, trusting that whatever he handled responsibly. I still remember the first time I met Marcus's situation head-on, nearly 15 years into our marriage, long before any of this reached the level it eventually did. He had called Gerald late one night asking for help covering a missed mortgage payment, and I watched my husband transfer nearly $3,000 without a single moment of hesitation or discussion with me beforehand. When I asked about it the next morning, Gerald simply said that was what family did for each other, and that his father had done the same for his own brothers throughout Gerald's childhood. I did not push further that first time, telling myself it was a reasonable act of generosity between siblings, never imagining it was the first thread in a pattern that would eventually stretch across nearly 2 decades of quiet financial rescue. My own sister, Patricia, voiced concerns about this pattern far earlier than I was willing to admit she might be right. She had met Marcus only a handful of times over the years, yet she often remarked that something about his relationship with Gerald felt lopsided in a way that worried her, one brother perpetually rescuing the other, without any real change in the underlying behavior that kept creating the need for rescue. I remember defending Gerald during those conversations, insisting that loyalty to family was simply part of who he was, part of what I loved about him. Patricia never pushed the matter aggressively, but she made it clear, gently and consistently over the years, that she thought Gerald's inability to say no to his brother would eventually cost us more than money. Gerald's mother, a formidable woman named Evelyn who passed away 6 years into our marriage, had instilled in all 6 of her children an almost sacred belief that family loyalty superseded every other consideration, including financial prudence or personal boundaries. I remember one particular holiday dinner, years before my surgery, when Evelyn openly praised Gerald in front of the entire family for always taking care of Marcus. Language that made my stomach tighten even then, though I could not have articulated why at the time. Marcus beamed under that praise, and I noticed, even in that moment, a flicker of something uncomfortable pass across Gerald's face, an expression that suggested even he understood the weight of the role he had been assigned within his own family, whether he had ever truly agreed to carry it or not. Looking back, I can trace at least 3 other occasions before my surgery where Gerald quietly absorbed financial fallout from Marcus's decisions without ever fully explaining the details to me. There was the time Marcus's car was repossessed and Gerald arranged a replacement vehicle, registered in his own name, insisting it was simply easier that way. There was a period when Marcus and his wife lived rent-free in a rental property Gerald owned for nearly a year, an arrangement Gerald described to me only as helping them get back on their feet. Each time, I accepted the explanation at face value, never adding up the pattern as a whole, never realizing that Gerald was not responding to isolated emergencies, but managing an ongoing, chronic financial dependency that had simply become part of the invisible architecture of our marriage. Gerald's other siblings, I would later learn, had long ago stopped extending Marcus the same generosity, having drawn firm boundaries years earlier after their own difficult experiences, lending him money that was never repaid. Gerald's sister, Denise, told me during a difficult conversation months after everything came to light that she had warned Gerald repeatedly over the years that his inability to say no to Marcus would eventually consume more than he could afford to give. Gerald, she said, always responded the same way, insisting he was the only one who could truly help, the only sibling with both the means and the willingness to keep Marcus from losing everything. Denise admitted she had stopped bringing it up entirely in recent years, tired of watching her brother absorb consequences that were never truly his to carry. I think, too, about my own parents' very different approach to family and money, a contrast that only became clear to me in hindsight. My father had always believed firmly that helping family members financially should come with clear boundaries and honest conversation, a philosophy he practiced consistently throughout my childhood whenever relatives faced hardship. Growing up in that environment, I assumed every family operated with some version of the same transparency, never imagining that Gerald's family had built an entirely different, quieter system, one where difficult truths were managed rather than discussed, where protecting someone from stress was valued more highly than including them in decisions that directly affected their own home and finances. I also think now about the early years of our marriage, when Gerald and I first discussed how we wanted to handle money as a couple, sitting at our small kitchen table in the first apartment we shared, drawing up a simple budget on notebook paper, the way young couples often do. We agreed then, in principle, that we would discuss any significant financial decision together, a promise that held reasonably well for the ordinary expenses of building a life, a mortgage, 2 children, retirement contributions, but seemed to quietly exempt itself whenever Marcus's needs entered the picture. I did not notice, in real time, how that single exception slowly widened over the years until it became large enough to swallow $80,000 and, eventually, 12 people living inside our home. My own health had been declining slowly for nearly a decade before my surgery, a persistent ache in my lower back that gradually became something I could no longer ignore or manage with over-the-counter medication. I worked as a high school administrator for over 20 years, spending long hours on my feet, and I told myself the pain was simply the price of a demanding job and getting older. It was only after months of physical therapy failed to bring any real relief that my doctor finally recommended spinal fusion surgery, a procedure that would require weeks of complete immobility, followed by months of careful, supervised recovery. Gerald promised me, in the weeks leading up to the surgery, that he would handle everything at home so I could focus entirely on healing. I believed him completely. I had no reason not to. In the months before my surgery, I noticed Gerald growing increasingly tense whenever Marcus's name came up, more tense than I had ever seen him during their previous financial troubles. He took phone calls in the garage rather than the kitchen. He stayed up late scrolling through his phone with an expression I now recognize as barely contained panic, though at the time I attributed it to ordinary stress about my upcoming surgery. Looking back, I understand now that Gerald was not worried about me during those final weeks nearly as much as I assumed. He was worried about something else entirely, something he had already decided he would handle in the only way he knew how, regardless of what it meant for our marriage, our home, or my recovery. My surgery took place on a Tuesday morning in early spring, a 4-hour procedure that Gerald sat through alone in the waiting room, according to the nurses who cared for me afterward. I remember very little of the first 2 days following the operation, drifting in and out of consciousness, my body wrapped in pain medication thick enough to blur the edges of everything around me. Gerald visited each day, sat beside my bed, held my hand, told me everything was fine at home. I had no reason to question him. I was fighting simply to manage the pain radiating down my spine each time I attempted even the smallest movement, entirely unaware that while I lay there recovering, decisions were being made in my own home that I would have never approved had I been conscious enough to weigh in. By the 4th day after surgery, still confined to my hospital bed, I noticed Gerald's phone buzzing constantly, more than usual, pulling him out of the room for hushed conversations in the hallway that lasted longer each time. When I asked who kept calling, he told me it was work matters, nothing urgent, nothing I needed to worry about while healing. I believed him, the way I had believed him for over 2 decades of marriage, never suspecting that the calls he stepped away to take were coordinating the arrival of his brother's entire family, along with an aunt and a cousin, into the home I had spent years making comfortable, all while I remained too weak to lift a phone myself. I was discharged 11 days after my surgery, still requiring a wheelchair for any distance beyond a few steps, still adjusting to rods and screws that made simple movements feel foreign and painful. Gerald wheeled me through our front door with a nervous energy I mistook for excitement about having me home. Instead, I found suitcases lining the hallway, unfamiliar shoes stacked by the door, and voices coming from the guest rooms that had once been reserved for my own recovery equipment and quiet rest. Gerald knelt beside my wheelchair and explained, in a rushed and apologetic tone, that Marcus's family had faced an emergency, that they needed somewhere to stay immediately, and that he had made the decision himself while I was still under anesthesia, certain I would have said yes had he simply had time to ask. Among the relatives who arrived that first week was a cousin named Todd, Marcus's business partner in the failed construction venture, a detail I would not fully understand until much later. Todd occupied what used to be my sewing room, a small space I had converted years earlier into a quiet retreat, where I kept my mother's old machine and spent weekend afternoons working on projects that brought me peace. Finding his belongings scattered across that room, my mother's sewing table pushed into a corner to make space for an air mattress, struck me with a particular kind of grief that had little to do with the larger crisis unfolding around me, and everything to do with how thoroughly my own small comforts had been overrun without a single thought given to what they meant to me. My closest friend, Susan, came to visit 4 days after I arrived home from the hospital, expecting to find me resting quietly, the way we had discussed during my final days in the hospital. Instead, she walked into a house full of unfamiliar faces, children running through the hallway, and me sitting in the corner of my own living room looking, in her words, like a guest in a house I had lived in for 2 decades. Susan pulled me aside into what remained of my bedroom, the one space Gerald had managed to keep clear, and asked me directly whether I was safe, whether I needed help, whether this was truly a temporary arrangement, or something Gerald had allowed to spiral far beyond what any reasonable person would consider appropriate during a spouse's medical recovery. I did not have an honest answer for her that day, only a growing unease I could not yet fully name. I sat in that wheelchair in my own hallway, too exhausted and too much in pain to properly process what I was hearing, watching strangers who shared my husband's last name carry boxes into rooms that were supposed to be mine to heal in peace. That first night home, I could not find a single space in my own house that still felt like it belonged to me. Every room occupied, every quiet corner filled with voices and movement that made genuine rest impossible. I lay awake that night, my spine aching, my mind racing, wondering what emergency could possibly justify moving 12 people into a home before its owner had even had the chance to recover enough to walk to her own bathroom unassisted. The chaos of those early days extended even to the smallest details of daily life that I had once taken entirely for granted. My kitchen, once organized precisely the way I liked it after years of careful arrangement, became nearly unrecognizable within the first week. Cabinets rearranged to accommodate additional groceries, my carefully labeled spice rack disassembled and never reassembled the same way twice. I remember sitting at the kitchen table one morning, still moving slowly with my walker, watching Marcus's children eat breakfast at what used to be my quiet reading spot by the window, and feeling a wave of grief so specific and so small that it embarrassed me. Grief over a chair, over a window seat, over a version of my mornings that no longer existed. Gerald attempted, in his own way, to shield me from the worst of the disruption during those early weeks, moving my recovery equipment into what remained of our bedroom and asking the relatives to keep noise to a minimum during my designated rest periods each afternoon. I recognized, even then, that some part of him understood how much strain this arrangement placed on my recovery. Yet he never once considered that the deeper solution was honesty rather than quiet accommodation. He managed the symptoms of the chaos he had created rather than addressing its actual cause, bringing me tea, adjusting pillows, apologizing quietly for noise levels, while never once sitting me down to explain the true reason 12 people needed to remain under our roof for as long as they ultimately did. My physical therapist, a patient woman named Rhonda who visited twice weekly during those early months, noticed the tension in our household almost immediately, commenting after only her second visit that my recovery seemed to be progressing more slowly than she would have expected, given the otherwise successful nature of my surgery. She gently suggested that stress could meaningfully impact healing, particularly for a procedure as delicate as spinal fusion, and asked directly whether something at home was interfering with my ability to rest properly between sessions. I remember deflecting her question that day, unwilling to fully articulate the chaos surrounding me, though her concern stayed with me, another quiet confirmation that something in my environment was actively working against the healing I was supposed to be focused on entirely. My youngest son, Ryan, still living nearby at the time, visited during the second week of the arrangement and grew visibly upset watching his mother navigate a crowded, chaotic house on a walker, unable to find a quiet corner to rest in her own home. He offered, more than once, to have a direct conversation with his father about the situation, frustrated by what he saw as an obvious imposition on my recovery. I asked him, at the time, to hold off, still clinging to Gerald's promise that everything would resolve itself soon, a request I now recognize as another small way I allowed the situation to continue longer than it should have, protecting Gerald's timeline instead of my own well-being. The weeks that followed my surgery were unlike anything I had imagined for my recovery. Instead of quiet mornings and slow, supervised physical therapy exercises in a peaceful home, I woke each day to the sound of children running through hallways, relatives arguing over kitchen space, and a general chaos that made even basic rest feel impossible. I was in no condition to confront anyone directly, still relying on a walker most days, still managing pain that made raising my voice or standing for long conversations genuinely difficult. Instead, I began quietly observing, noting small details from my bed or from the corner of the living room where I spent most of my recovery, piecing together a picture that did not match the simple story Gerald had given me about a family emergency. I noticed, first, that Marcus rarely left the house at all, not for work, not for errands, not even for simple fresh air, behaving less like a man temporarily displaced and more like someone actively avoiding being seen in public. His wife spoke in hushed, anxious tones whenever her phone rang, often stepping outside entirely to take calls she clearly did not want overheard. The aunt who had also moved in, a woman named Carol, who I had met perhaps twice in 20 years of marriage, seemed to know far more about the situation than she let on, offering me sympathetic glances whenever Marcus's name came up in conversation. Glances that suggested pity rather than simple family solidarity. Gerald, meanwhile, grew increasingly evasive whenever I asked direct questions about how long this arrangement would last, or what exactly had happened to force his brother's family out of their own home so suddenly. He offered vague answers about a business situation and a temporary setback, always promising more details once things settled down, details that never quite arrived, no matter how many times I asked. For a brief and painful period during my investigation, I allowed myself to believe something entirely different was happening, that perhaps Gerald's evasiveness stemmed not from a financial secret, but from something far more personal, an emotional entanglement I had not considered. I noticed him growing quieter around Carol specifically, sharing knowing glances with her that Marcus's wife did not seem to share, and for nearly a week I convinced myself I was uncovering an affair rather than a financial conspiracy. I confided this fear to Patricia over the phone one evening, my voice shaking in a way it rarely did, and she gently reminded me not to build a story from fragments before I had gathered enough real evidence to understand what I was actually looking at. It was Patricia, in fact, who helped me approach the investigation with more structure once I explained the strange transfers I had found in our accounts. She had experience reviewing financial documents from her years working in accounting, and she walked me through, patiently and methodically, how to trace transfers, identify patterns, and recognize the kind of financial structuring Gerald had used to keep these payments hidden from routine review of our joint statements. Without her guidance during those difficult weeks, I am not certain I would have understood the true scope of what I was looking at, buried as it was beneath years of small transfers, designed specifically to avoid drawing attention to themselves. I also noticed, during this period, small interactions between Todd and Marcus that struck me as inconsistent with the story Gerald had given me about a simple family emergency. The two men spoke in low voices about the partnership and what Gerald already knows. Language that suggested Gerald's involvement went back much further than the recent crisis alone. When I gently asked Todd about the construction business they had run together, he grew visibly uncomfortable, offering only that it didn't work out, before quickly changing the subject to something unrelated. A deflection so obvious that it only strengthened my growing certainty that everyone in my house was protecting a story far larger than the one I had originally been told. I began quietly checking our joint financial accounts during moments when the house grew quiet enough for me to think clearly. and what I found unsettled me far more than the chaos already filling our home. Several large transfers had been made from our savings in the months before my surgery, transfers Gerald had never mentioned, each one going toward something labeled only as family assistance. It was a conversation I overheard by accident, late one evening while resting on the couch that had become my temporary bed, that finally gave me the thread I needed to pull. Marcus, believing I was asleep, spoke quietly to Carol about creditors, about people looking for him, about how grateful he was that Gerald had found them somewhere no one would think to look. I lay there perfectly still, my heart pounding harder than my healing spine could comfortably handle, finally understanding that whatever had brought 12 people into my home during the most vulnerable weeks of my life was not a simple family emergency at all, but something far more calculated and far more dangerous than Gerald had ever admitted to me. Once I understood that Marcus was hiding from creditors rather than simply facing a temporary setback, I began piecing together the full scope of what Gerald had actually done, and the picture that emerged was far worse than I initially feared. Years earlier, without ever telling me, Gerald had co-signed a substantial business loan for Marcus, who had used the funds to open a small construction company that ultimately failed within 18 months. Rather than allowing Marcus to face bankruptcy and the consequences of that failed venture on his own, Gerald had quietly been making payments toward that debt for years, draining portions of our savings gradually enough that I never noticed the full extent of what was leaving our accounts. The situation had grown far more urgent in the months before my surgery, when Marcus's creditors began pursuing more aggressive collection efforts, including threats of legal action against both Marcus and, because of the co-signed loan, against Gerald himself. Rather than telling me the truth and risking my reaction during an already stressful time, Gerald had decided the safest solution was to physically hide Marcus and his family within our home, reasoning that creditors would be far less likely to locate them there than in any residence connected directly to Marcus's own name. My surgery, rather than being incidental to this decision, had actually made our house more appealing as a hiding place, since Gerald calculated that my recovery would keep me too preoccupied and too physically limited to object or interfere with whatever arrangements he made. The full weight of this realization hit me hardest when I discovered that Gerald had also quietly used a portion of our home equity, without my signature or knowledge, to make a final settlement payment toward Marcus's debt just weeks before my surgery. A transaction he had structured in a way that technically required only his signature due to how our original mortgage documents had been filed years earlier. I sat with those financial records spread across my lap one afternoon, still confined largely to a walker, understanding for the first time that my husband had not simply made a poor decision under family pressure, but had deliberately withheld years of financial truth from me, culminating in a choice that used my own vulnerable recovery as cover for a crisis he had been managing in secret for far longer than I ever imagined. As I continued piecing together the financial trail, I discovered something that complicated my understanding even further. Evelyn, Gerald's mother, had also contributed to covering Marcus's earlier debts before her death, meaning this pattern of quiet family rescue predated even my own marriage to Gerald by several years. Gerald had essentially inherited his mother's role as the family's financial safety net, a responsibility he had never openly discussed with me, one he seemed to carry as an unspoken family obligation rather than a choice he ever felt he was permitted to question or refuse. Understanding this history did not excuse his silence toward me, But it did help me understand, with a complicated mixture of anger and sympathy, why he had never once considered simply telling me the truth as it unfolded. During this period, I also began paying closer attention to Marcus's wife, a soft-spoken woman named Angela, who seemed to carry a particular kind of exhaustion that went beyond simple embarrassment about their circumstances. One evening, while helping her fold laundry in what had become a shared task among the household, Angela admitted quietly that she had urged Marcus for years to be honest with Gerald about the true state of their finances, rather than allowing small emergencies to compound into the crisis we now found ourselves living through. She told me she had never wanted to move into our home, that she had argued against it the night Gerald proposed the idea to Marcus over the phone, understanding better than her husband did how deeply this arrangement would strain a marriage already carrying more weight than it should have to bear. I also spent considerable time during those weeks reviewing old emails and text messages between Gerald and Marcus, messages I had never thought to look through before, searching for any earlier indication of how deep this financial entanglement truly ran. I found conversations dating back nearly 6 years, references to the loan situation, and, keeping this between us, language that made clear Gerald had been actively concealing the scope of his involvement from me for far longer than the recent crisis alone. Reading those messages, sitting alone in what remained of my quiet moments during recovery, I felt a particular kind of loneliness settle over me, understanding that my husband had been carrying an entire second financial life alongside our shared one, invisible to me until circumstances finally forced it into view. A neighbor of ours, an older woman named Beverly, who had lived next door for nearly 15 years, stopped me one afternoon while I was slowly making my way down the driveway with my walker, gently asking whether everything was all right, having noticed the unusual number of cars parked along our street in recent weeks. I gave her a vague, reassuring answer at the time, embarrassed by a situation I did not yet fully understand myself, though her question lingered with me afterward, a reminder that our private crisis had become visible enough to draw attention from people who had no direct stake in it at all. Further evidence of just how far this arrangement had grown beyond anything resembling a discreet, temporary favor. There were nights during this period when the weight of building a case against my own husband, quietly and alone, felt heavier than the physical pain of my recovery itself. I remember sitting in the bathroom, the one room in the house that still afforded any real privacy, going through printed bank statements by the light of my phone, so no one would hear the printer running late at night. I cried more during those weeks of quiet investigation than I had during the entire physical ordeal of surgery and rehabilitation combined, grieving not just the deception itself but the particular loneliness of having to become a detective inside my own marriage, gathering evidence against a man I had trusted completely for over 2 decades. I also began, during this period, quietly documenting everything I observed in a small notebook I kept hidden inside a hollowed-out book on my nightstand: dates, overheard conversations, financial figures, anything that might later help me understand or prove the full scope of what was happening around me. Writing things down gave me a strange sense of control during a period when I had so little control over my own physical body, let alone my household. I filled nearly 40 pages over the course of that investigation, a record I still have today, tucked away in a drawer, a reminder of just how methodical I had to become in order to finally understand the truth about my own life. I confirmed the full scope of the debt through a conversation with a family friend who worked at the bank Gerald and Marcus had used for the original construction loan. She confirmed, carefully and somewhat reluctantly, that Gerald's name appeared not only as co-signer on the original loan, but on 2 subsequent refinancing agreements, meant to keep Marcus's business afloat during its final, failing months. The total amount Gerald had ultimately committed to protecting his brother from, spread across nearly 5 years of quiet payments and refinancing, exceeded almost $80,000, a figure that made the recent home equity transaction feel less like an isolated bad decision and more like the final chapter in a much longer story of financial entanglement I had never been permitted to see clearly. The final piece of this story fell into place when I discovered that Gerald had, in fact, considered telling me the truth on at least 2 separate occasions before my surgery. According to a conversation I later had with Denise, who Gerald had confided in briefly during one particularly difficult week. Denise told me Gerald had called her, uncertain and anxious, asking whether he should simply explain everything to me before my operation, rather than risk me discovering it during recovery. Denise, believing at the time that the crisis would resolve quietly without ever requiring my involvement at all, had advised him to wait, to spare me the stress during such a physically vulnerable period. Learning this detail complicated my anger somewhat. Understanding that Gerald's silence had not been entirely his decision alone, but the product of a family culture that consistently prioritized managing crises quietly over confronting them honestly, regardless of the cost to the people left in the dark. I also learned, during this final stage of piecing everything together, that Gerald had briefly consulted a financial advisor nearly a year before my surgery, seeking guidance on how to extract himself from Marcus's ongoing financial dependency without severing the relationship entirely. The advisor, according to notes Gerald had kept in a folder I discovered tucked away in his home office, had recommended exactly the kind of honest, structured conversation with me that Gerald ultimately avoided, suggesting that involving me directly would create a stronger, more sustainable boundary than Gerald attempting to manage the situation alone. Gerald had paid for that single consultation and never returned, choosing instead to continue managing the crisis quietly, a decision that, in hindsight, represented the clearest missed opportunity to have avoided everything that eventually unfolded during my recovery. Denise eventually told me the specific night Gerald made his final decision to move Marcus's family into our home, a detail that struck me harder than almost anything else I learned during this process. It was the same evening I was admitted to the hospital for pre-surgical testing, hours before my actual operation, while I sat in a pre-op room answering routine questions from nursing staff. Gerald had stepped into the hallway to take a call from Marcus, learned that creditors were preparing to visit Marcus's home directly within days, and made the decision on the spot, alone, without a single moment of hesitation to consider consulting me, even hypothetically, about a choice that would fundamentally alter our home for months to come. I sat with that detail for days afterward, turning it over in my mind, unable to fully separate my anger at Gerald's decision from a strange, unwanted flicker of understanding for the impossible position he believed himself to be in that night. He was, by his own account later, terrified, watching his brother's entire life threaten to collapse in a single phone call, and he reached for the only solution his family had ever modeled for him: immediate, decisive, and entirely private. Understanding his fear did not erase the harm it caused me, but it helped me see, more clearly than before, that this was never a story about a husband who stopped loving his wife, but about a man who had never learned that love and honesty were supposed to travel together. I confronted Gerald on a quiet afternoon nearly 6 weeks after my surgery. Once I had gathered every document, every transaction, every piece of the truth I needed to finally speak without simply reacting out of pain and exhaustion. I asked him to sit across from me at our kitchen table, the same table now permanently crowded with extra plates and mismatched chairs, and I laid out everything I had discovered, watching his face shift from surprise that I had found the truth, to a slow, resigned shame that told me he had known, deep down, that this moment was always coming. He did not deny any of it. He simply asked, quietly, what I wanted to do now that I finally understood everything he had been carrying alone. Karma, in this story, did not arrive through some dramatic public reckoning, but through the simple, unavoidable consequences Gerald had spent years trying to outrun. Within days of my confrontation, the very creditors Marcus had been hiding from finally located him, not through any failure of Gerald's plan, but through Marcus's own carelessness. A phone call made from a number that was eventually traced back to our address. The confrontation that followed forced everything into the open at once. Legal proceedings, family accusations, and a level of financial exposure that Gerald could no longer manage quietly from the shadows of our marriage. Marcus and his family left our home within the month, facing the consequences he had spent years avoiding, while Gerald and I faced a different kind of reckoning entirely, one built around years of silence rather than a single mistake. Our marriage did not end, though there were weeks I genuinely believed it might. What kept us together, in the end, was not forgiveness offered quickly or easily, but a long, difficult process of rebuilding trust that started with Gerald finally being honest about every financial decision he had made without me, going back years further than even Marcus's failed business. I still think often about those first weeks home from surgery, unable to walk without assistance, surrounded by strangers in my own house, completely unaware that my own vulnerability had been calculated into someone else's plan for survival. If you came home from a moment of complete physical vulnerability to find your own home no longer felt like yours, would you have found a way to forgive the silence that led you there? Or would that silence be the one thing you simply could not move past? Marcus, to his credit, eventually took accountability in a way that surprised me, given how passive he had seemed throughout the months he lived under our roof. Once the creditors located him and the situation could no longer be managed quietly, he sat down with both Gerald and me and acknowledged, for the first time, how much he had allowed his brother to sacrifice on his behalf over the years, without ever seriously working to change his own financial habits. He has since begun making small, consistent payments toward reimbursing Gerald directly, a gesture that will likely take years to complete, but one that has slowly begun to soften some of the resentment I still carry toward the choices made during those difficult months. Our adult children, when they eventually learned the full story, reacted with a mixture of anger toward their father and quiet concern for me, several of them admitting they had always sensed an imbalance in how Gerald handled money involving his side of the family, though none of them had ever seen the full extent of it either. My daughter, in particular, sat with me one evening and asked whether I regretted staying, a question I did not have an easy answer for even months after everything had come into the open. I told her honestly that some days the answer felt clearer than others, and that healing a marriage after a betrayal like this one is rarely a single decision, but a series of smaller choices made again and again, long after the initial shock has faded. Denise, for her part, apologized to me directly once she understood the full extent of what her advice to Gerald had ultimately enabled, admitting she had underestimated how severely the situation would escalate and how much it would ultimately cost my own recovery and peace of mind. Our relationship remains cordial today, though something between us shifted permanently once I understood the role she had played, however unintentionally, in keeping me uninformed during the most vulnerable weeks of my life. I do not blame her entirely, understanding that she, too, was operating within a family pattern that predated either of us. But I have also learned, since all of this unfolded, to trust my own instincts about my own home and my own recovery far more than I once did. Gerald and I eventually began attending couples counseling together, a step neither of us had ever seriously considered during 2 decades of what I had always believed was a fundamentally strong marriage. Our counselor helped us understand that this crisis, while triggered by Marcus's financial troubles, was ultimately rooted in a much older pattern within Gerald's own upbringing, one that equated love with quiet self-sacrifice and equated honesty, particularly around difficult topics, with unnecessary burden placed on people he cared about. Learning to separate those two things, protection and honesty, has become the ongoing work of our marriage since everything came into the open, work that continues today, months after the last of Marcus's family finally moved out of our home for good. Recovery, I have come to understand, is about far more than healing a spine. It is about learning to trust your own home again, your own space, and the person you built that space with in the first place. Gerald and I are still married today, still working through the layers of honesty we should have practiced years before any of this happened. Marcus, for his part, eventually rebuilt his life on his own terms, though our relationship with him and Carol remains distant, carefully guarded in a way it never was before. I do not know if that distance will ever fully close, and some days, I am not entirely certain I want it to. I have also had to reckon, in the months since, with my own role in allowing this pattern to persist for as long as it did before my surgery ever became the breaking point. I recognize now that my own reluctance to press harder, to ask more pointed questions during those earlier years of vague explanations and quiet transfers, allowed Gerald to believe that managing crises without my full involvement was an acceptable way to operate within our marriage. This realization does not excuse what he did during my recovery, but it has taught me something important about the quiet ways we sometimes train the people we love to keep things from us, simply by accepting incomplete answers for far too long. Susan, who had been there from the very first difficult week, told me recently that she has watched me change in ways she finds quietly remarkable since all of this unfolded. More direct in conversations, less willing to accept vague reassurances from anyone in my life, including Gerald. I laughed when she said it, though I recognized the truth in her observation immediately. The woman who once accepted, "It's temporary," and "I'll explain later," without pushing further, no longer exists in quite the same way. Recovery, for me, ended up meaning far more than spinal healing. It meant relearning how to ask harder questions, and refusing, from now on, to let silence stand in for honesty, no matter how good the intentions behind it might be. Looking back on the entire ordeal now, I recognize that the physical scars from my spinal fusion surgery healed far more predictably than the emotional ones left behind by those months of discovery and confrontation. My spine, reinforced with rods and screws, grew stronger and more stable, exactly according to my surgeon's timeline, each follow-up appointment showing steady, measurable progress. My trust in Gerald, by contrast, followed no such predictable timeline, healing in fits and starts, some weeks feeling nearly whole again, others reopening as easily as the day I first confronted him at our kitchen table. I have learned, slowly, that some kinds of healing simply cannot be rushed toward a fixed date on a calendar, no matter how badly you want them to be finished. What stays with me most, even now, long after the walker was replaced with steady, independent steps, is how completely unaware I was that the most vulnerable weeks of my life were being used as cover for a crisis that had nothing to do with my own healing at all. I think about how easily silence disguises itself as protection, how a husband's desire to shield his wife from stress can quietly become something closer to deception, however good his intentions may have started out. I do not offer easy answers about where protection ends and dishonesty begins. I only know that I lived through the blurred line between the two, recovering from surgery in a house full of strangers, while the truth waited months to finally catch up with all of us. What do you think you would have done in my position, discovering that your recovery had been used as cover for a crisis kept hidden from you for years? Would you have confronted Gerald the moment you found the truth? Or would you have waited, as I did, until you had every piece of evidence in hand? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one of them. If this story kept you watching until the very end, consider subscribing so you never miss the next one, because there are more stories like this one still to come.